Hello, everyone. So, today we'll be talking about realist theories of international relations. And our objective here is to find out what are the major assumptions of the realist theories, what realist theories of international relations exist. Remember, we said that realism is one of the categories of IR theories. And so there are some other theories under the realist category. So we want to identify what are these realist theories, what are the major assumptions of these theories, who are their major proponents, and maybe identify one or two criticisms against these realist theories of international relations. So that's what we're going to be doing in this presentation. Now, we identify that realism is one of the two older categories of international relations theories. The other one is the liberal theory, which we'll be talking about subsequently. Okay, but realism is one of the older categories of IR theories, and this theory is believed to have originated, around the First World War, around the First World War, and the failure of the League of Nations to prevent a Second World War. Of course, the League of Nations was the first attempt, the first attempt, considerably to arrive at an international institution, that would promote collaboration and cooperation among states, that would kind of promote a liberal system of international relations. But since the League of Nations failed, states became skeptical about the efforts at cooperation, the the um, the motive behind cooperation from other states, and the fact that you cannot clearly tell what motives states have of coming to the table, of asking to cooperate. And so states have remained skeptical about the liberal approach. And so that's how the realist school of thought began. Was, of course, that's how the realist school of thought became more pronounced, became more emphasized in international relations. And this school of thought, or this category of theories, like we said, centered around political power. How do states struggle for power? How do states compete for power? What methods do states employ in expanding, improving their political power? And of course, it also talks about security, national security particularly. And I'll also add interest, national interest, which of course are one of the ways by which states want to further or achieve, the ways by which states try to achieve their interests and what methods they go about spending. We talked about the neoliberal, the classical liberals, the neo-realists and classical realists, as subcategories of the realist school, and they how they emphasize, on the one hand, the classical realists emphasize the role of the human instinct, in propelling competition, while the new realists emphasize the structure of the system as being anarchic, and how that also helps to propel or promote the competition that states engage in. Now, of course, realism, you know at its very essence, or at its very core, argues that conflicts are inevitable. So states would always, you know, go to war, or states will always be involved in one kind of conflict or the other. They could be violent, they could be non-violent, but of course we cannot do away with conflict. States cannot do without conflicts at some point in international relations. So these are just a few things by way of introduction. Now, of course, there are so many assumptions of the realist school of thought. All right. But some of the major assumptions of realism are the fact that states are the most important actors in international relations, and we gave some reasons why that is the case in our previous presentations. We said that the international system is structured around sovereign states. Sovereign states are the core, entities of the international system, of the structure of the international system. Sovereign states have that feature of sovereignty that makes them ultimate authorities. They have no higher authority to report to, and so they are they're able to determine their own action. They're able to devise means of going about achieving their interests, and they're answerable basically to no other authority, and so that makes them the most important actors, the very primary, the key actors in the international system from a realist perspective. That's what the realists argue, that states are the major and most important actors. They also argue that states are not just unitary actors, but are also rational actors. And what do we mean by states being unitary actors? Now, of course, from our discussion on the actors in international relations, we identified that there are some actors that are sub-states, meaning that these actors exist within state boundaries, but of course these actors have influence on foreign policy of such states within which they exist. All right. Now, states have a responsibility of harnessing, of synchronizing the interests of all these sub-state actors, individuals, investors, local companies, manufacturing industries that are within the state. The states have a responsibility of synchronizing the interests of all these actors to ensure that it comes up with a foreign policy that satisfies to a very large extent, that takes into consideration the interest of all these actors within it. So the state is more or less um, an entity that helps, or that is seen as a melting pot. It harvests the interest, of these actors, and aggregates these interests in such a way that the foreign policy of the state represents all these interests that are within such a state. And of course, again, it's expected that the foreign policy of the state is also a rational policy, that the states make rational decisions on behalf of these entities that exist within it. All right. So in that sense, the state is a unitary actor because it represents other interests. It represents, so it serves as unitary. So whatever the state does, whatever the state, decides to do or decides not to do, represents the actions, represent the sentiments of other actors that are within the state. That's why the state is a unitary actor. The state is rational also because it is expected to make the best choice, it's expected to implement the best course of action, among several alternatives. All right. Another assumption is that this international relations is conflictual. We have talked about the fact that conflicts are inevitable, from a realist perspective. So realists see international relations as a conflictual relationship among basically state actors. All right, where tensions rise and fall, and sometimes even wars, are inevitable. States have to go to war. Violence, has to be violence has to occur, so to speak. So conflict is also a very important assumption of the realist school. Another assumption is the competition for power. That, of course, comes, with the conflictual nature of international relationship as well. So the two assumptions seem to be linked. In fact, all these assumptions of the realist school seem to be linked one to the other. All right. So competition for power or struggle for power is one very key assumption of the realist school of thought. They argue that states are constantly in contest. States are constantly in competition for what is called hegemony. Every state wants to have so much power that it is able to stand above other states, because that gives it a unique advantage in its interaction and relationship with other states. And so that competition is constantly on from various sides, and of course power has been one very controversial concept, in international relations, because power is very subjective. Power is very multidimensional. All right, power could be economic power, it could be social power, it could be religious power, it could be political power. So power is very multidimensional. And so when you talk about the struggle for power, it could be military power. We don't know exactly from what side, what state is pursuing power. All right, because the pursuit for power involves all of these dimensions that we have mentioned. So that further complicates the issue. But these are some of the assumptions. Other assumptions include the fact that the state, has a primary goal to survive, and the state would pursue this goal at all costs. Even if it means going rogue on other states, if it means declaring war on other states, at what cost, at whatever cost that states, would have to bear, they would do that to survive. So survival is the basic instinct of states. And of course, these actions, these survival actions, these survival strategies that states adopt are subject to several other variables, which we'll talk about as we go along as well. Of course, another assumption is that states will always want to increase their military capabilities, their arsenal, their military arsenal, their military intelligence, their military strategies, you know, the more funds in the military. So focus on military power is one major assumption of the realist school of thought. States are more focused on military power. How do we improve our military? How do we ensure that our military is stronger, our military is more alert, our military is more equipped, and so on and so forth. So those are some of the assumptions. And of course, another assumption is that international relations, focuses, or states are international relation focuses around great powers. Great powers as states that have attained a particular status, in the international system. Powers that are more or less dominant powers. All right, and so these powers are more decisive. These powers are more authoritative. They are more influential in the order of things. And so international relations basically revolves around these powers because they have the finance, they have the military, they have the intelligence. They're able to influence as much as possible international relations in their own favor. So these are some of the assumptions of the realist category of theories. Okay, so we'll go now to identify what are some of these realist theories. What are some theories of international relations that argue from a realist perspective? All right, we have identified the balance of power. We have identified decision-making theory, dependency theory, deterrence, games theory, security dilemma theory. These are not all the realist theories that there are. Okay, but these are some of the ones we'll be discussing in this presentation. And like I said, our emphasis here is to identify what are the assumptions of this theory, of these theories. What do these theories argue? What are the major arguments that these theories are making? Who are their major proponents? And perhaps one or two criticisms against these theories. We'll begin with the balance of power theory. Now, balance of power is a theory that argues that international relations, the relationship among states in the international system, is maintained by a kind of balance of power structure. All right, there's a structure of power relationship among states that helps to maintain the relationship among these states. And so once that balance exists, once there's a balance in the power relationship, then there's peace, then there's prosperity, there's progress. So peace is a consequence of balance, of a balance in power relationship among states in the international system. That's the argument of the balance of power theory. All right. So conflict occurs from the balance of power perspective. Conflict occurs when that balance has been distorted. So when the balance of power relationship has been distorted, that is when states become agitated. That is when tensions increases. That is when conflict ensures, and most likely wars can also occur. All right. So in order for that to be avoided, whenever there's a distortion in the balance, there has to be a counterbalance. All right. And of course, the power that counterbalances basically just helps to return the power relationship back to the balance. So it means that when the balance of power is distorted, there's a balancer that helps to return that distortion. Okay, to correct that distortion so that power returns back to a balanced structure. All right, and of course, this balancer could be one state, it could be a couple of states, a group of states coming together to achieve the balance. But essentially, what we're saying is that counterbalancing helps to return a previously balanced structure back to balance. All right. So counterbalancing occurs when there has already been a distortion in the balance. Okay, counterbalancing is not a distortion in the balance itself, because that is an area that many people misunderstand. So you have a balanced structure. Counterbalancing does not occur to cause a distortion in the balance, but rather counterbalancing occurs to return the relationship back to a balance. I'm hoping that is clear. And I said the balancer who performs this counterbalance, of returning a power relationship back to balance, can be one state or can be a couple, a group of states, working together to achieve that counterbalance that returns the power relationship back to status quo so that peace can prevail. All right. Now, this theory has proponents such as Hans Morgenthau, Kenneth Walls. All of these are some of the proponents of the balance of power theory, and the argument is that for peace to occur in the international system, there has to be a balance in the power relationships, power relationship among states. Once there is an alteration in the balance, then there's likely to be conflict and tension, and a counterbalance is needed to return that order back to status quo. All right. Now, the question, one of the criticisms of this approach is exactly the issue around how do you measure power? Okay, how do you measure power? What is the measurement of power? How do you determine how much power a state has? And what powers qualify a state to either serve as a balancer or help to return, balance back to order. So all these issues around power and around the measurement of power, bearing in mind the fact that power is multidimensional, power is subjective, and what constitutes power for one state can be different from what constitutes power for another state, because power comes, or you approach power from various dimensions: economic, political, sometimes religious, particularly in this contemporary in the contemporary international relations. Religion has become one very key factor in discussions about around power. So that multidimensional nature of power is one of the criticisms, of the arguments against a balance of power theory. The fact that power is relational. It's not something that you own. It's not a property. You can be powerful today and tomorrow you are not. You can be powerful tomorrow, today you are not. So that relational, relative nature of power is one very, very key critique of the balance of power theory. The second theory we'll be talking about is the decision making theory. This theory is also referred to as the rational choice theory. Rational choice in the sense that the decision that is eventually made has to be a rational decision, has to be the best decision among the among the choice or among the alternative that exists. So there has to be a very there has to be the best, there has to be the ultimate decision, there has to be the most effective decision, among the alternative that exists or the alternatives that exist. And so that is what is called the rational choice. All right. So rational choice or decision making theory argues that individuals, the choices that individuals make, have a very huge role to play in international relations. So decision making approach centers around the individuals who make the decisions in the first place. All right, because decisions are made by individuals, whether they are decisions for organizations or decisions for states or decisions for governments. Of course, governments represent states, but essentially, all of these decisions are made by individuals. Because if you're talking about a state is represented by certain individuals. All right, and these individuals are the ones who make decisions on behalf of the state. So, decision making basically emphasizes the role of individuals in making choices, making decisions on behalf of states or other actors, and of course, the role that these individuals also play in international relations because of the choices, because of the decisions that they make on behalf of these other actors. All right. So individuals are responsible for the behavior of states because they ultimately make decisions on behalf of the states, and essentially the preferences, the personal individual preferences, the 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 values, the ethics of these individuals essentially color the decisions that the individuals make. So if you have an individual who is highly religious, or who is very conservative, or who is very dynamic, you know, or very or very open and subject to change, all of these sentiments, or very highly moral, all these sentiments are likely to color the decisions that are made by such individuals, and eventually those that are made by the state, because these individuals represent the state essentially. All right. Now, decision making is a process. It's a process that involves certain steps. If it has to be effective, if it has to be worthwhile. All right. And so there has to be some kind of gathering of information. There has to be some kind of analysis of this information that will lead to the ultimate decision at the end of the day. There has to be some cost effects analysis of various choices that are available to be made. There has to be, so there are various steps in decision making. And all these steps need to be followed one after the other, for a very effective, very rational for the best choice to be made at the end of the day. And one of the criticisms against this approach or this theory is that sometimes the individuals who make these choices do not have all the time to go through these steps. Individuals have to make choices, very, very rapidly, very quickly. They have limited information, they have limited time, there are limited resources at their disposal to make those decisions, and then those decisions have to be made. Okay, so sometimes these choices are not very rational. That is the argument against this approach. That sometimes the decisions that are made are not the best decisions. So leaders sometimes make irrational choices, sometimes make bad decisions, and that is the consequence of the process that is involved in arriving at those decisions. Of course, Joseph Snyder is one major proponent of this approach as well. And so that is what the decision-making theory argues, that decisions are product of individual choices, individual preferences, and individuals are the ones who eventually make the decisions. And so if the process of decision making is not followed systematically and carefully too, most likely the decision that we made at the end of the day would not be a very sound, would not be a very rational choice. That's what critics argue, against this theory. Of course, we also have the dependency theory, which argues that a group of countries which classify themselves, or which are in the category of what we call the first world countries, have perpetually succeeded in ensuring that another group of countries regarded as third world countries remain third world countries. So the argument here is that third world countries, the countries we know as third world countries, became and have remained third world countries as a result of some of the policies, some of the practices, some of the variables, that have been emphasized and promoted by first world countries. And of course, these variables are more or less capitalist oriented, capitalist driven, capitalist emphasized decisions, policies, variables that most of the world is immersed into right now. So dependency theory is basically arguing that these global capitalist motivated policies and programs have perpetually impoverished, have perpetually held back third world countries from developing out of a third world status into, a higher status, so to speak. All right, and this has been on right from the period of decolonization, all the way to independence and even till today. That's what the dependency theory argues, and of course, while the dependency theorists recognize that some of the obstacles, some of the challenges to development are also internal, issues of bad governance, issues of corruption, issues of greed, issues of insecurity, issues of ethnicity, of division, of nepotism. All these internal issues are also a cause, are also some justification for the fact that third world countries have remained third world. They also recognize that external factors are equally not left out. Factors as foreign aid and the conditionalities that come with this foreign aid, factors as the policies of global capitalism, factors as some of these foreign external factors that have continued to keep states impoverished, foreign loans, investment, foreign direct investment by states, by some multinationals that have certain capitalist inclined motivations. All right. So these are some of the obstacles. These are some of the challenges that have kept third world countries in their, to remain third world. All right. So they are not only external factors, but they are also internal factors. And so it must be a balanced argument. That's what the dependency theorists argue. While we look at the consequences of external factors, we must also x-ray, what has been going on the inside as well. And Walter Rodney is one very prominent dependency theorist, with his famous Why or How Europe Underdeveloped Africa classic text, which has also been has remained very relevant even up till today. Okay, so that is the dependency theory, the fact that third world countries have remained third world as a result of exploitative or exploitatory policies, programs, variables that have been promoted by the global capitalist structure of international relations that is propelled and emphasized by the more advanced first world states or first world countries or powers. All right. Now, deterrence is another theory of international relations that is a realist theory, argues from a realist perspective. And deterrence basically argues that a state, is able to deter, is able to dissuade, to discourage an act of aggression, all right, by another state. Now, how a state is able to do that, of course, will depend on several strategies, several programs, several policies that such a state decides to embark on. But basically, the argument is that any state that wants to launch an aggression would first of all weigh the costs and benefits of such an aggression, on whoever it is that whichever other state that act of aggression is intended for. All right. So, for instance, if state A wants to perform an act of aggression on state B, state A has to count the cost of such an aggression on state B. Would it be more costly? Would it be more beneficial? And in a situation where it is more costly for state A and less beneficial, then of course the likelihood of deterrence is increased. But in the situation where such an aggression is more beneficial for state A and less costly, then deterrence is reduced. All right. So every state, the argument is that every state is working tirelessly to ensure that they are at an advantage point where aggression against them costs more and has less benefit. And so that increases the deterrence for aggression against such a state. Okay. Now, of course, this theory assumes, or this theory argues, that states are able to choose their own action. Every state has a liberty, is sovereign. So a state can decide what they want to do, and how they want to go about it. But of course, remember we said such decisions are based on several other variables, and cost benefit is one of such variables as well. A state, even though it has the power to decide whatever it wants to do, it wants to make such decisions around some cost benefit analysis to ensure that such an action, such a behavior is beneficial and less costly for them. A state also is able to assess the likelihood of retaliation for whatever behavior they make, whether it is a trade policy, whether it is a social policy. They are able to weigh the likelihood of the response, of the reaction of other states or of the other states to such a policy. All right. The theory also argues that states are able to know the scale of such a retaliation. Not just that, are they able to weigh the likelihood of a retaliation, whether or not a retaliation will occur. But in the case where it occurs, they are also able to determine to a very large extent what is the scale, how intense will such a retaliation be, how minimal will it be, to what extent will it damage, and so on and so forth. So all of these are things that states are able to assess for themselves before they eventually launch any attack or any aggression or any act of aggression against another state. All right, and all of these things are also included in the cost-benefit analysis that goes into such an act of aggression. So in the event where a state finally decides to launch such an act of aggression after all this, after taking into consideration all these issues, then it means that the deterrence from the other states is very low. And so the states, the aggressor state has taken into cognizance, has made its own analysis, and it has determined that an aggression will be more beneficial to it and less costly for it. But where a state has done this analysis and has refrained, has been discouraged from launching such aggression, then it means that the deterrence is high. And so the state has determined that any aggression against this other state, would be very costly and will benefit very little. And so they have been dissuaded successfully. They have been discouraged from such an act of aggression. That's what the deterrence theory argues. So basically, states will always weigh cost and benefits, before launching any act of aggression or any act of violence against another state. Of course, this theory was basically coined in the Cold War, was established in the Cold War, during the Cold War years, when the US and the USSR were at the peak of their rivalry, their ideological rivalries. That was when the deterrence theory was coined by a US former Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. I think that's his name. John Foster Dulles coined this theory, saying that the US would react with an equal or even a more, with either an equal or a higher scale, if it was attacked by any means. So that way, the USSR was careful. The US was also careful because at that time the USSR had also perfected the act of the nuclear weapon. So both states had the nuclear weapon. Both states, put themselves at an advantage where any act of aggression against them would lead to almost an equal or maybe even more fertile retaliation. And so, they were very careful about that. Of course, it began by what was called the doctrine of massive retaliation, that every act of violence against the US would be met by massive retaliation. And so that was when the deterrence theory, gained prominence during the Cold War. And of course, we know that theory was very, very effective during the Cold War because in so many points, or at so many points during the Cold War, there were several acts of aggression. There was so much tension between the US and the USSR, in Cuba, in North Korea, or in the Korean War, in the Berlin Wall confrontation, and so many other instances where the US and the USSR were very close to another nuclear war, but because of deterrence, because of the cost-benefit analysis that both states would have done to determine or to realize that any act of aggression would warrant an equal or a higher retaliation, and so they kept their cool. All right. So that is some insight into the deterrence theory, and of course, it's a theory that was largely used to dissuade states from using the nuclear weapon, because if you use a nuclear weapon on me, I use the nuclear weapon back on you, and so the benefits for that will not be very palatable, will not be very acceptable. And so that was essentially what the deterrence theory was built around the use of nuclear weapons, particularly during the Cold War. Thomas Hobbes, Jerry Bentham, all of these are some of the proponents, of the deterrence theory. And one major criticism against the deterrence theory is the fact that cost-benefit analysis could go wrong, you know, because you don't exactly know how to measure how much power the other state has or what the intent of the other states are, So cost-benefit analysis could go wrong. A state could, in their cost-benefit analysis, could come up with the analysis that an act of aggression would cost less and and benefit them more. But in the actual sense, when such an act is launched, they see that the reverse is the case. And of course, the vice versa is also true. So such cost benefit analysis could be very erroneous, since states are doing that almost blindly, almost blindly, because they don't have all the information on the other states that they need. They don't have all the information that the other states has. They don't know exactly how much power is at the disposal of the other states. The security dilemma theory is another very interesting realist theory. And this theory basically says that every state, or basically argues that every state is constantly in a dilemma. Is constantly in some kind of struggle between two options. And what are those options? Do we invest in military power? Do we invest in defense? Or do we not invest in defense? Those are the two options that every state, is faced with, particularly in terms of nuclear investment, in terms of nuclear weapons manufacturing, in terms of military power. Do we invest or do we not invest? And the consequence of these two options would largely bring about some kind of security concern, in the sense that if a state decides to invest, such a state becomes a threat to other states around it, particularly those other states that are not as powerful. Such a state that is investing in security, in defense, in military power becomes a threat. If it decides not to invest, of course, it becomes very vulnerable, and that also is a security concern. So, whichever option a state decides, poses some security concerns. And that's why it's called the security dilemma theory, because every state is in constant dilemma between these two options. Do we invest or not? And whichever option the state decides to go for has security consequences. All right. So this theory basically describes a situation where states, states are at a loggerhead, or they're at they're confused about whether to invest or not to invest, and the security concerns that arise from such decision whether to or not to invest in military power or in defense. And the argument is that once a state invests, they become a threat, and if they choose not to invest, they become vulnerable. And so whichever choice they make, there are security concerns, there are security implications. And so in the interest of the state, they have to make the best possible choice, which of course, from a realist perspective, would include investing in defense, investing in military, in military power. And of course, by that, they will become a threat. They would be seen as a threat by other states, and that could also lead to some kind of attack on the state. Seeing that they are investing, they're trying to improve their military power. So, in essence, what we're saying about the security dilemma theory is that the dilemma arises out of a choice between two options: to invest or not to invest in military power. And that whichever choice a state makes has security implications. So where a state decides to invest, such a state is seen as a threat. Such investments are seen as a threat by other states, and it could lead to an attack on this state that is innocently investing just to improve its military power. Where a state decides not to invest, such a state becomes very weak and vulnerable to any aggression against that state. And so there is a dilemma. There's a dilemma that has serious security implications. Two scenarios, two consequences of the security dilemma, of the choices that are made. Two consequences could either be the preventive war or the preemptive war, and these are consequences of the decision to invest in military power, military capabilities, to invest in trying to improve, the military power of a state. All right. So preventive or preemptive wars are acts of aggression against the state that may just be trying to invest in its military capabilities. All right. Now, the preventive and preemptive war are very, very similar in their definition. Okay, but the difference lies in the motive behind these wars, or the motive behind these aggressions. For the preventive war, the motive is to try to limit, to try to reduce the casualties, to try to minimize the effects of a war early enough by attacking first. You're trying to minimize the effect of a war by attacking first, because if you leave the attack till later on, or till a much later time, you might have more casualties. The attack might be more, or it might have more negative effects. And so in order to avoid these circumstances, you try to attack first. All right. Whereas for the preemptive war, the motive, is to try to prevent a state from gaining some kind of balance of power advantage. They're trying to prevent a state from gaining a balance of power advantage, from gaining a more superior status to yours in international scene or international arena. And one very important example, or one very significant example of the preemptive war is the US war on Iraq in 2003. All right. this war was a preemptive war because the US preempted that Iraq had, some nuclear weapon program, and so they went to war in Iraq hoping to find nuclear weapons, but eventually there was none found. All right. So preemptive wars, and of course, if indeed Iran had any nuclear program, that was a threat to the U.S. The U.S. The U.S. power, the U.S. status in international relations, and so that was some kind of preemptive, war that was fought between the U.S. and Iraq. The U.S., of course, launching aggression first against Iraq. So both preemptive and preventive wars are very similar in definition, but the motive behind them, are slightly different. Preventive, trying to minimize, reduce, an imminent danger. There's evidence, very large evidence that a war is inevitable. And so in order to minimize and reduce the number of casualties, the extent of damage, you try to attack first to prevent such damage. In the preemptive war, you're trying to secure, a state is trying to secure its own influence, its own status, its power, its role in the balance of power relationship by preventing another state from assuming a more influential role in the balance of power structure. All right. Of course, these things might sound a little abstract and technical. You can only understand them as you consult with other materials. You try to read wider and familiarize yourself better with these variables, with these concepts, and perhaps the explanation will become a little clear or a little clearer. The last realist theory we'll be talking about is the games theory. And the games theory basically, likens international relations to a game. In fact, there has been an argument by some scholars that international relations can be likened to a game of snooker, where you have a snooker board which serves as the international system. You have the balls on the snooker board which serve as the actors, whether state or non-state actors, and of course, as you poke the ball, it hits on other balls as it makes its way to the hole. All right, and that hitting that it has with other balls, or that contact it makes with other balls, and interactions, as it's international relations in play essentially. All right, and sometimes, of course, you have the white ball, which serves as a hegemony, which serves as the one, who more or less dictates to a larger extent the play, the way the system operates, what goes on in the system, and so there's that analogy of the snooker board and international relations. All right, but the games theory basically, also toes the same line, saying that international relations is essentially a game. Every actor is trying to maximize profit and minimize loss. And so in doing that, actors are very sensitive. Actors are very conscious of their every move. Whether it is even an interaction, actors want to ensure that in trying to cooperate, they have a high advantage. In competition, actors are trying to ensure that they stand at a vantage point. So every action, every inaction that states make in this sense, we're emphasizing on states because states are seen as the most important actors in international relations. That's why we are insisting on emphasizing states in this lesson on realism. All right, so every action or every inaction that states make or do not make, you know, is centered around the idea of minimizing loss and maximizing profit. All right, and so state actors essentially are seen as players who are in a game and trying to make profit out of this game. And of course, in most cases, they want to win all. I mean, they want to have a complete victory in the game. The players, want a complete victory in the game, and that's what results in what is called the zero-sum game. You know, which is of course a realist, which is the realist argument or the realist perspective of the kind of game that goes on in international relations. A zero-sum game where the winner takes it all. You know, the winner takes it all, and of course the loser goes home empty-handed. So the zero-sum game is more likely to be the realist's idea of the game of international relations. So you play to win it all. You play to win it all, and of course that would include several policies, several strategies that will ensure that you don't leave your opponent with any kinds of victories whatsoever. There's no compromise, there's no middle ground. You just want to win and maximize all the profit that there is. All right, and of course it also means that this game involves more than one player. So it means that there are several states, at least there's more than one state to be involved in such a game. And so essentially the games theory, views international relations as a game that involves states as players, and in this play or in this game, every player is trying to play so much so that they win all the stakes while other states go home completely empty-handed. And so that determines the kinds of strategies that they implement, the kind of decisions and indecisions that they arrive at or that they decide to implement, and decides so many other moves by these actors. Okay, so these are some of the theories of realism that exist. Like I said, you can go on to find out more realist theories. You can go on to find out what other realist theories exist, and you would see that essentially these theories emphasize the major assumptions of the realist school of thought, which we said the fact that the state is the most important actor, the state is a unitary, is a rational actor, the state, or international relations is conflictual. International relations is centered around the struggle for power, centered around the struggle for political power, for military power, and of course other dimensions of power that exists. It is conflict reading, it's conflict oriented, and there's that attention, there's that influence and emphasize, or there's that emphasis rather on the influence of great powers in the international system. Okay, so these are some of the assumptions of the realist school of thought. These are some of the theories that help to buttress or emphasize, these assumptions of realism. So, like we said, theories are perspectives from which to view the same issue. All right. So all these theories that we have listed, all these realist theories, are various perspectives from which you can view a realist, which you can view realism, or which you can perceive the arguments of the realist in how interactions, relationships go on in the international system. But we're going to have to stop here, and of course, in subsequent lessons, we'll talk about the liberal category of theories, we'll talk about the critical category of theories, and we'll see how these are different. I thank you so much for your time. And of course, if you have questions, if you have comments or contributions, we can take the conversation further. Okay? Thank you once again for your time.